Okay, ladies and gentlemen, just going to do a short review with you here on what to expect for your ecology final, which, by the way, is next week, Monday, November 21st. Um, that would be 2016, just in case if you're trying to get out of doing this final. It's not going to happen. If you don't make it up on, if you don't take it on Monday, you'll take it on Tuesday. If we have to push it back, um, it's a big worry of mine that you're not going to be here Monday or Tuesday, but we will probably end up taking it when you come back the 28th. But my attempt here is to try to help you get ready for that test. I would say that you need to spend some time with your Quizlet cards. All 6 chapters are in the Ecology Final workspace where you found this video. You will also find that Ecology Review PDF. Please spend some time with that over the weekend. I know it's a short weekend. That's why I'm trying to get this video up tonight so that you could spend 3 days doing some studying and getting ready for this test. It is a 64 question test. It's broken down by standards that we have covered for this. Actually, it's a 68 question test, excuse me. But it's broken down by standards that we have covered. So I'm going to review with you by standard. You'll see that on the test when you take it on Mastery Connect on Monday. Those numbers really shouldn't affect you all that much, but I do want to go by standards. So the first standard that we are going to look at on the test is 3.1.c.a. And that's the standard that talks about living organisms. Remember, living organisms have 8 characteristics. They are made of 1 or more cells. Either they are unicellular or multicellular. Again, we are multicellular. They're organized. They start at the cellular level. Then they go to many cells come together to form tissue. Many tissue come to form organs, organs to organ systems, and then organ systems to organisms. They need energy, so we have to intake some kind of food. Most organisms either can create their food, they are a producer slash autotroph, or they consume food or eat food, which is a heterotroph or a consumer. They grow and develop not only in size, but also in intellect. They must be able to reproduce. That's the whole question of is an animal like a liger or a mule considered a actual organism due to the fact that they can't reproduce. Okay, so obviously they're a living organism. They just don't have the ability to reproduce. They evolve over time. Okay, so over time we're going to see some adaptations within organisms. They are going to maintain homeostasis within their internal areas. They're going to be able to naturally have hormones being produced that will help them to combat different levels that are going on. And then they respond to stimuli. That is the first standard that we're looking at. The next standard is 3.3.a.a. And what we have underneath that is we're talking about reproduction, sexual versus asexual. Remember, when we talk about that, the asexual reproduction that we talked about had 4 different types. Binary fission, which you take one cell and it creates a new identical cell. Budding is a part of that organism, starts to grow. As it gets old enough or mature enough, it will fall off and start to grow. We have vegetative fragmentation. Remember the example that I gave you of the aloe plant. I can take a clipping off of the aloe plant and then plant it, and it will regrow. Then the parthenogenesis, which is the virgin birth. Okay, all different types of asexual reproduction. The big thing that you need to understand about asexual reproduction, it's very fast, and there's no partner needed. So the only downside to asexual reproduction, or the big downside, is there's no diversity, no biological diversity. So you're getting exact copies or exact clones. And when we talked about, density dependent versus density independent factors, density dependent, if a disease comes through, it's going to wipe out that whole organism, because there's no way for the organism to fight off that disease, because they're all the same. One gets sick, they'll all be dead with asexual reproduction. So no diversity. Now with sexual reproduction, it is slower, and you do have to have a partner. But the big thing about sexual reproduction is it does give us that genetic diversity, and you're going to get a lot of biodiversity there. So a lot of differences. Again, that's why, yes, we're all humans, but we all have different characteristics. Even within our family units, where you're sharing the same genetics, you're still getting some diversity. It could cause mutations also, which does drive a big part of evolution over time. The next standard is 4.1.A. And what we are talking about is how are we from the point of organism organized. So again, we go from organism to population. Remember, population, same species, same place, same time. Community is multiple sets of populations in the same place at the same time. Ecosystem is all your community plus those abiotic factors. And then the the biosphere, again, is the part of the earth that actually supports all living things. Also underneath this standard, we talk about symbiotic relationships. Remember, symbiosis is characterized by two organisms in close relationship. We have mutualism, where it's a plus-plus situation. Both organisms are going to benefit. For example, the sea anemone and the clownfish. The sea anemone is the sea anemone gets protection, but also the sea anemone gets cleaned off by the clownfish, and it provides protection for the clownfish. You have commensalism, where you have one organism benefiting, the other organism is unharmed, so doesn't benefit or is not harmed. And then you have exploitation / parasitism, where one organism benefits, the other organism is harmed. With parasitism, there has to be a host, okay, and usually refers to another organism using inner fluids to live off and get the nutrients. Now, understand, when you talk about symbiosis, or symbiotic relationships, if it does not say that one is harmed or helped, it's going to be commensalism, okay? For instance, when we talk about the oxen moving around in the grass and the birds flying in and eating the bugs as the oxen moves around, it did not say that the oxen were being affected by the insects. So the bird eating the insects really is only helping the bird, not helping the oxen also. Next standard is 4.1.A.B. And that's where we talk about the different population dynamics. Again, a population is the same organism, same place, same time. Remember, population range really is referring to the population size, the total number that is there. When we talk about population distribution / dispersion, we're talking about those three characteristics. Is it uniformly dispersed? Are they clumped? Or are they randomly placed? And the big thing that we look at when we look at those is that where are the resources? And that is what really drives how our dispersion rate is. Then we talked about the two kind of factors that will affect populations. We talked about density dependent, which are your biotic factors, disease, competition, predator-prey relationships. They are really dependent on how the population is dispersed. Again, disease comes through, wipes out a organism that are closely clumped together. If they're uniformly or randomly placed, that disease may not affect it as much. Predators may not be able to have access to hunting the prey if they're randomly placed versus clumped. The density independent are those abiotic factors. totally does not depend on if the dispersion rate. It's going to come through and work on everything in its path. That's when we have natural disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, different things like that. The next standard is 4.1.A.C, and it is our habitat versus niche. Remember, habitat is where an organism lives, and the niche is its kind of job or its description that it does within the environment that it's living. We also talk about the difference between food web and food chain. Remember, food web is a more complex or a mixture of multiple food chains. But what we are doing is we're looking at how the energy, starting with the sun, is transferred through an ecosystem. So basically what we're doing is looking at what eats what, okay, and how is that energy transferred to the next level. What we also have to look at there too is we have to look at how different organisms are affected when one might be pulled out. For instance, if I have a producer that dies out and becomes extinct in that area, how's it going to affect your primary consumers? Will it affect your secondary consumers? Does the ecosystem have enough resources to be able to sustain life there? Which leads us into the next standard, which is 4.1.B.A. And we talk about limiting factors, whether they be abiotic or biotic factors. Remember, those abiotic factors are the non-living factors. Could be anything like climate, the amount of sun, the amount of water, soil content, anything there. And then the biotic, which is anything that's living, okay, and reverts back to how those 8 characteristics, what distinguishes if it's living or non-living there, okay? And when we talk about those limiting factors, really what we are looking at is the carrying capacity of an area where that population is. So that those limiting factors is what's going to get us to our carrying capacity. And if you remember, that's the 2 graphs that we talked about, the J curve being the exponential growth where resources are high. There's no competition for resources. So as long as there's no cap on the resources and there is no competition, they're going to grow exponentially, meaning very quickly. Whereas your logistical growth, that S curve, really is what we're talking about when we're talking about carrying capacity. That's the ability of that area and what it can sustain in a good manner. Okay. Again, the 2 ways that we can decrease the amount of population in an area is death and emigration with an E. Remember, exiting out, E. Increasing the amount of population is birth or immigration with an I, population coming in. We talked about abiotic versus biotic. That's standard 4.1.B.B. So remember, abiotic is those non-living, biotic is the living. The next standard, 4.1.C.B, we are talking about the primary versus secondary succession. Remember, the big thing to remember is in primary succession, we are starting from bare, nothing, no soil at all. So we're starting with rocks, and then we have what we call those pioneer species, the lichens and the moss come in. They start to grow, and what they do is they mix in with the debris off the small rocks, start that level of soil. Then we get the earlier grasses that have not very good root systems come in. They start to break down the ground again and move into what we are really that mature system that we call the climax community. When we talk about it, also we are looking at secondary succession. Secondary succession, the big difference between secondary succession and primary succession is it starts with soil and then the amount of time that it takes to get to that climax community. Secondary succession does take a while, but not near as long as primary succession because it already starts with, it's already going to start with some soil, okay? You need to know about range of tolerance also. That's the abiotic and biotic conditions that provide optimal environment for the organism to survive. So that's range of tolerance. Standard 4.1.D.B, we talk about extinction. Okay. We talk about what are the big reasons for extinction. That would be, habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive species coming in, overexploitation or hunting, no conservation aspects there in place. So when we look at that, most of that is related to human issues when we talk about extinction. We talked about the keystone species. Extinction of a keystone species of a community could lead to the extinction of other members. That's why we talk about that keystone. If you remember, and maybe not gotten to this part, but arches that are made, stone arches that are made have a keystone, and that's the last stone that's put in. If you take that out, the whole arch falls down. So that's very similar in the scientific world with that. Then you need to know the difference between a specialist and a generalist. Remember, a specialist needs a very specialized habitat, and it does a special niche within there, whereas a generalist can live in a lot of broad situations and can fill a lot of different niches. Standard 4.2.A.A, we are talking about primary productivity, which is the total amount of light energy converted to the organic compound in a given area per unit time. So how much sun do we take in and how much energy can we create? Most of that energy that is taken in by, or the vast amount of energy taken into an ecosystem is always converted into biomass by plants. We talk about trophic levels. Okay. The first trophic level is the primary production level. That's where your plants are going to take energy from the sun and create food for themselves. And they are the baseline of the food pyramid and the trophic level. Then we have the primary consumers, which are herbivores. They will eat the plants. The next is the secondary consumers. They tend to be carnivores / omnivores that will come in and eat the herbivores. And then you just keep going up into the tertiary levels, the quaternary levels, moving forward. Again, all energy comes from the sun. So the next standard is 4.2.A.B, and that's where we start talking about the different types of consumers and different types of organisms. Where do they fall in? Are they herbivore? Remember, herbivore eats plants only. They're called a primary consumer. Carnivores eat meat only, called secondary consumers. Then we have the omnivore that eats both plants and meat. Can be in different levels depending on what it's eating. When we talk about the trophic levels, scavengers, really dependent on other animals to kill animals for them to eat. Example would be a vulture. We have decomposers and detrivorts, which takes molecular level organisms and breaks them down to get them back into our system. Then we have what we call producers or autotrophs. Remember, the autotrophs meaning they automatically make their food. Heterotroph would be everything that I've already talked about that needs to consume food. But plants can make their own food, so they are called the primary producers or autotrophs. Standard 4.2.A.C. Again, food chain versus food web. The food chain is the most basic way to track energy through a environment. Food web is a mixture of all those food chains together. How are we going to look at how is affected? What is a top predator? A top predator in a food chain or a food web is a species that only has arrows pointing to it, no arrows going away from it. Okay. Standard 4.3.C.A. When we look at survival rates, higher fitness means they're going to survive at a better rate. Mutations, we get back to that a little bit in this standard, and we talk about it being the most important source of variation, and it is very vital for our evolutionary process. The last standard that we kind of talked about is cycles, and it's in the 5.3.A.A. Nitrogen from the atmosphere. How does that get into the biotic parts of our areas? bacteria will fix the nitrogen into a form that can be taken up by plants through their roots. So the bacteria is working in symbiosis with the plants there. We also have within the water cycle, how do we release water into the ecosystem would be condensation and evaporation. How do we uptake it back would be evaporation and transpiration. How is CO2 put back into the system? That's doing through burning fossil fuels, respiration by us as humans as we breathe, exhale out, we exhale CO2, and then death and decay also. How is CO2 taken out is through photosynthesis, where the plant takes carbon dioxide and adds water and sunlight with it, and as a result makes their own food, but then also releases oxygen to us. The source of phosphorus in our world is basically through rocks, and really it's the only nutrient that doesn't cycle through the environment totally. So I would say, you need to spend quite a bit of time studying with this. Again, hit the Quizlet cards and the ecology review for the PDF. Look at that, spend some time, and if you do that, I know you'll be successful on this test. Let me get back to this here real quick. And so I can stop this maybe. All right. Have a good weekend.